Well, 1.4 million people is a lot of people to lose to crashes, to road crashes worldwide. And a lot of people believe that these deaths are avoidable and there's something that we can do about it, especially when we come to our context here in Nigeria, where we are set to lose about 40,000 people yearly as a result of road crashes. And of this figure, a sizable number of them are young people. The question is, what are we doing to ensure that, we are able to drastically bring down these figures? It doesn't look like we've done a lot, because first there was a UN Decade of Action that was declared that ended, I think, 2010 or 2011 to 2020. We didn't quite meet up with the target, and now a second Decade of Action has now been declared. Well, to tell us why we didn't meet up, and maybe what we intend to do differently in this second decade, we're now being joined by our guest in the studio. Professor Sydney Ibianusi is the country director and focal person, UN Decade of Action on Road Safety and Injury Prevention in Nigeria. He's also a professor of ortho, trauma and acute care surgery. Prof, you're welcome to Sunrise Daily this morning.
Thank you for having me.
Well, the figures are very worrisome. And oftentimes, yes, if you speak to a number of people, they are aware that, road crashes are common. They're almost something I will see on a daily basis, almost every day. When I'm coming to work, I see somebody has either driven into the gutter or driven against the curb, or something has just happened, or there's been a tire blowout. It's really commonplace. Why do you think, in your estimation, why didn't we meet the target to bring down road crashes by at least 50% in the first Decade of Action declared?
Thank you for this great opportunity. Yes, that's the question that's been asked globally. And the figure you just mentioned is a global figure. And
that's 1.4 million.
1.4 million. But having said that, the 1.4 million, over 90% of that actually come from lower income countries and middle income earning countries.
Oh.
So the developed countries seem to have escaped it. And surprisingly, these countries, like lower income countries, own about 13% of the global vehicle or traffic density, while almost 50% goes to the developed country, and then 45% to the middle income countries.
So the countries with the lowest amount of cars are having the highest number of crashes.
Paradoxically, that's exactly what it is. So you see where the emphasis is. But do you blame the developed countries? They had seen this problem ahead of time and then focused on it and took it as a major investment. Not just investment to save money, public health issues, and then immediate results, intermediate results, and long-term results is quite huge in all facets of development. So they've gone ahead to reduce to theirs drastically while we are still struggling. If you look at the figure that was posted about the behavior of traffic or road users, 51% resulting from speed. That speed is a human factor. There are other human factors. The issues of disobeying traffic laws, resisting traffic laws, using telephone while driving, texting, and all that, and then driving under the influence of intoxicants. And so these are all contributing, and they actually account for perhaps over 90% of road crashes. Okay? So for this purpose, as you rightly said, that these are preventable incidents, we try not to call it accidents anymore. So we call them crashes, because accidents are things that are unpredictable, unpreventable. So the idea is to move away. But you still have the proportion that will still be accidents. Those words, there's nothing you can do about it. Okay. Now, while again, back to what I was saying, the developed countries invested so much in terms of massive advocacy, involvement to all segments of the national development. The developing countries were struggling because they have not seen that road safety is a commitment, a call to service, and actually we can be saving a lot. In our country, the figure we lose between 3 to 5% of our national GDP is huge.
But when you say that they're not seeing road safety as a commitment, some people will say, but we have since moved. I mean, when we look at the history of ensuring safety on our roads in Nigeria, we seem to have developed a lot, especially with the advent of the establishment of the Federal Road Safety Corps. What precisely are we not doing enough of, even with the establishment of this corps, to have been able to see a significant reduction when we had a UN Decade of Action declared?
Okay, good. The advent of Federal Road Safety Corps was a major landmark achievement by the government then, 1988, because they had seen the menace of road crashes, and the projection was running, it was huge, it was quite steep. And that intervention actually slowed down that progression. And the question I always want to talk about is, I can imagine what would have happened if we didn't have a Federal Road Safety Corps. So they came, and of course they had a mandate. But the Federal Road Safety is an institution, the team lead in issues of road safety in the country because they have the mandate. There are other aspects of road safety management. That was the reason why the United Nations declared the Decade of Action, where they brought multi-stakeholder collaboration and multi-sectoral cooperation, realizing that every person needs to come on board. You have the people who build the road, you have the people who provide leadership, first of all. The policy makers and decision makers who provide the policy, the legislatures, and then agents like road safety and police will enforce it. Now, you have the road builders, like Federal Ministry of Works and Housing, and then you have the Federal Ministry of Transportation, who actually are managers of the roads after the construction and all that. Now you have the other aspect, which is the third pillar in the UN Decade of Action, which is safer vehicles and mobility. Now you need people like traffic administrators, the VIOs, ensure that only safer vehicles that meet safety standards ply on the roads.
VIO.
Yeah, and you also need the customs to ensure that only vehicle and the SON, standard organization, that meets safety standards are actually imported into this country. Now, beyond that, the fourth pillar is safer road users. That is all of us. As long as you're a road user, whether you're a driver, whether you're a pedestrian, whether you're a passenger, cyclists, tricyclists, we're all part of it. And that is where the major problem is. Because if you realize, the reason why most countries did not meet the target was because of failure of the human part of that. I agree, there are other things that are still deficient, the infrastructural deficiency in the developing country, but the major problem is the human factor, which requires major advocacy, and that's where the media comes in. In fact, the Federal Ministry of Information shares that aspect. That is their focus. Anyway, so we need to advocate, we need to reach out to Nigerians and call every road user to buy into the vision of what we're trying to do and see if we imbibe the culture of road safety. It's not just only the drivers. You have a pedestrian who's walking, and then you have pedestrian bridges, and they refuse to use it, and they want to run across the road.
Indeed, we heard about 40% of the figures people we lose are pedestrians.
Very correct. Very correct. That also is a factor of the speed we're talking about. When you have vehicles traveling at a higher speed within the built-up areas near the public structures like schools and markets and all that, the chances are that they're going to run into, especially where people commingle with vehicles. So, again, the policymakers and administrators need to also build roads that are safe with appropriate road infrastructures. They need to provide a pedestrian walkway. They need to present the cycling path for persons who want to cycle and all that. And then, of course, the proper road signage and markings so that people need to see these and of course, the key into that. And now, the fifth pillar, which is also very important, and that is where we're going to in the second decade of action. We're talking of a safe system approach, fail-safe system approach, is you've done everything, and like I said, some will happen, crashes will happen, those we'll call accidents. Now the question now is, what do you do after that? That's why we have the post-crash response, and that has to do with Ministry of Health. And part of what the Ministry of Health is charged is to ensure that they respond promptly and quickly to save lives of persons who have been injured. And it's not just because sometimes people die, not just from the crash, but they die from the events that follow the crash. If you do not get to them early enough, damages are done. And then by the time, and if they eventually get to the facilities and they're almost as good as dead, hospitals may not be able to do anything. So these are the 5 pillars of the UN Decade of Action. So it's a multi-sectoral, every person is on board. We still have the road safety championing, that's the key lead for this whole process. But for us in the UN Decade of Action, this is a mandate of the United Nations charging all member nations to key into this approach. So what we're doing is we have an overarching responsibility to bring all the stakeholders at the various segments in terms of issues of collaboration, cohesion, and cooperation. Okay, everybody playing their role.
Let me quickly take this to my colleagues in Lagos. I know they have questions for you. Ayo.
Yeah, thank you, Marco. You know, Prof, one of the things that you in enumerating the 5 pillars, you would also know that the 12 voluntary global, targets also set for this second decade of action enumerated, the 5 pillars, such as this one, which talks about applying high quality standards to new and used vehicles. And you talked about this earlier. The question that one would want to ask about this is the enforcement of such a thing. Yes, it is voluntary. It is a suggestion from the United Nations. As you said, FRSC is leading the challenge of enforcement of these things. It is right there in our faces. I don't even know, if there is any way of determining the quality of vehicles that can come into any country. Back in time, you would remember, for instance, that there was certain standards of fuel for specific cars. There was premium, there was super, back in time. I don't even think there is any such thing as at this time. So that's just one example. How do we maintain these standards, for new and used vehicles that are coming into the country, especially when, most of these LMICs that you talked about don't make cars?
Thank you for your question. And yes, like you rightly said, one thing is to make a policy, another thing is to enforce the policy. And enforcement for us is failure of implementation of a policy. If a policy is implemented and you have people buy into that policy, and the policy is running, then you may need little or no enforcement. However, what we realize is you need to advocate and reach out to persons, get them to understand the reason. Most of the time it's education, and that's what we're doing now during this week. Educate the people, let them understand why they should adhere to the set rules, and it's to their own benefit. The issue of standardization is the responsibility of Standard Organization of Nigeria. And of course, you have the engineering societies too. And then you have Automotive Council of Nigeria. They are also part and parcel of the Decade of Action on road safety. And they have the mandate to come up with the standards of vehicles that should come into this country. We, at some time in our national history, decided to stop the drive on the right side, the right-hand driving steering, and went to the left side. It was based on empirical evidence and scientific publications that, look, it's safer to drive on that side, and then we changed and all that. And we enforced it, and it worked. Now, talking about seat belts, when we started the seat belt policy, initially there was a lot more resistance, and then, of course, with cohesion and some enforcement, people have imbibed the culture now. Almost every person is doing that without anybody chasing any person, because they've understood and seen the benefit of it. Now, for vehicles coming into the country, I do know that the government set a target that there's a number of years some vehicle that should be allowed to come into the country. And then that enforcement, of course, we have the borders, we have the ports. The customs are there to ensure that only vehicles that meet those standards come in. But of course, you do know there's always some people trying to change established rules. It happens everywhere. We will continue to advocate. People need to understand that it's not just a government thing. It's their own benefit. And if you do know that if you're driving a vehicle that is not safe, and that the chances that if a crash happens, then you may not be able to survive, or you may survive and you are maimed for life. And then, of course, you're going to have your dependents now being exposed to a lot of hardship, economic hardship, social and devastating problems. So the issue of enforcement is very important. That's really important. However, I think if you have a lot of Nigerians understand what they should do and buy into these policies, then the need for enforcement become less and less. But in the interim, while you are having issues getting people to obey the set rules, then of course the enforcement agencies will need to step up the game. So they need to enforce. And they need to, like my Minister of State did mention during the opening ceremony in his keynote address, he actually talked about that. Good thing to have policies, good thing to have laws. If they are not enforced, then of course it doesn't mean anything.
It leaves a challenge right there, Prof. Yes, just 1 second. You listed a number of agencies and departments of government that are supposed to collaborate. You've talked about the SON, the customs, the engineering societies, and all of that. It would sound, it sounds like there hasn't been significant collaboration among these bodies. Perhaps that will explain the report of the United Nations in reviewing the first decade of action to say that we weren't able to meet the targets. If these are some of the reasons from some of the things that you have said, are there other reasons? And what are we doing to ensure that at the end of this second decade of action, we're not where we are right now?
Thank you very much. Yes, the issue of collaboration is very important. No single agency can do it alone. Federal Road Safety cannot do it alone. They need the Ministry of Works, they need other MDS, they need private sector participation. Road safety management is actually more of a private sector driven issue in the developed country. No government can fund road safety, it's very expensive and all that. So part of what we're doing in the UN Decade of Action is engaging both the government MDAs, bringing all of them on board, bringing the organized private sector, Nigeria Union of Road Transport Workers, Road Transport Owners Association, and all of them, and then the other organized private sector, the fleet operators, the fleet managers, even the big multinationals, NNPC, SPCDC, ExxonMobil, Total, they are part of the partnership we're talking about. And then on the other side of it, we have the civil society organizations, the NGOs. The United Nations actually are driving to ensure that the NGOs participate keenly, because they are the ones that can preach this gospel to the people and get across to the people. The other aspect, what we looked at, is we've been at the national level during the first decade of 2011 to 2020. Most of the activities were done centrally. Now, in the second decade, one method or one approach which we're advocating and want to reach is to cascade it down to the subnational levels. During our engagement with the Vice President 2 days ago, and he actually endorsed the 30-kilometer per hour thing within the built-up areas and in the communities, in the rural communities, and in the urban cities. Okay? Now, the idea is to reach out to the subnational levels. So we're engaging the Nigerian Governors Forum, we're engaging the ARGON, Association of Local Government of Nigeria. Tomorrow, all the ARGON chairmen in 36 states of the Federation and FCT are having a conference. Well, it's a virtual conference. As part of this 6th Global Road Safety Week, we're going to be talking about the Street for Life, Love 30. The idea is to cascade it down to the subnational levels. And then, if you realize that the 65% of roads are owned by the local government in the country, and 25% owned by the states, and only 70% owned by the federal government. So you need a lot more to be done at the state level and the local government level to be able to reach the target. And then the other thing, we're talking about 50% reduction in death and disability from road crashes, bearing in mind that the crashes will occur, but if they do, at least you should be able to save 50% of persons involved in this sense. What we now thought of doing is to improve on our response, emergency response activity, by the Federal Ministry of Health. And as you do know, the Federal Ministry of Health is in the process of rolling out a national emergency medical services and ambulance services for the country that will collaborate with various tiers of government to respond to emergencies, which include road traffic crash emergencies.
I'm just wondering, though, how realistic is a 30-kilometer-per-hour speed limit? I mean, I've seen in a number of estates where they put this as the speed limit, and people are still going well over it. You still see there, even though they have speed bumps, 30 kilometers is rather slow, isn't it?
Oh, well, that's what you think. It is not rather slow if you consider that it's built up area. These are areas that are, I mean, if you're on the highway, and of course nobody's talking about 30 kilometers, but built up areas and...
built up areas like
yeah.
how? I mean, like where? Let us use Abuja here, for example,
okay.
or maybe, I don't know if you're
very
familiar with Lagos.
The city center areas, particularly where you have schools, and then in Abuja, you talk about the central area, you talk about maybe Wuse2, you talk about the Garki district areas, and all that. Okay, not the main roads. Then, of course, you have areas where people...
Not the main roads, not the Ahmadu Bello way.
Ahmadu Bello way, we expect that there should be pedestrian walkway, there should be cyclist track where people who want to ride their bicycles should... So the road should provide for that. But if you have areas like... the center of these districts, okay, I'm not too conversant with the Abuja, but I could tell you that...
What major city are you conversant with?
No, even the Abuja. I'm just like, if you get to, apart from the major streets to talk about, Ahmadu Bello, Muhammadu Buhari, and all that, but even with those ones, okay, they already have the speed bumps and all that, but people do not even obey that. Part of what we think to realize that is to provide some alternative method of enforcement. Maybe have speed tables rather than just bumps that just fly across. That if you want to now rush through those things, you're going to be damaging your vehicles and all that. That will force you to really stop. We have the zebra crossings that are already there. People who want to stop their vehicle at the zebra, they'll stop on the zebra. Meanwhile, there's a mark where they should stop and all that before the zebra to allow.
But isn't that I mean, isn't that a lack of enforcement? Because, I mean, a lot of people have said that even in the developed countries where they have made significant success with reducing the number of road crashes, it's not by wave of hand. If you actually go against the rules, you would be severely punished, and your punishment will come to you whether or not there's an officer there. You will get your ticket at home.
Good.
So what are we doing to get to that level where, people, if they're not going to use the initiative to obey the law, there will be stiff penalties for, going against the law.
Oh, great. That's what actually, you really hit the nail there. You talked about the developed countries using all sorts of methods to enforce. We were still developing. It's a work in progress. For now, we're still using manual methods, using physical methods to enforce and all that. If you listen to the keynote address of the Honorable Minister of State and that of the Secretary of Government of speech of Secretary of Government of Federation, and of course reinforced by the Vice President on Tuesday, the idea is to use technology now to enforce this. The commercial, even in his own statement, talked about people are driving at high speed and you're going to chase them. If you chase them at that high speed, you're also violating the law. And the process is that if any crash happens, both of you are already exposed and at risk. So using some technology, you should be able to capture maybe the number plates, maybe radar guns and all that, and then find a process to send them tickets. And then now we're having the digitalization of identity and all that. All that will cascade into trying to reach out to some of these offenders. And by the time they send you tickets, and then of course they're able to catch you even after 2 months or 3 months, you have violated law, and the penalty is steep, then of course next time you think twice before you want to violate the law. So you cannot run away with technology. you must have to find a way to bring in technology to enforce these things. The issue of speed limiters, which was introduced by Federal Road Safety, yes, and you can see the resistance by a lot of persons. The speed limiters are not really meant for this, the cities. It's meant for the highway and all that.
How effective have they been?
Oh, well, the process is still ongoing, and I'm sure they're already implementing it. But initially targeted to the commercial operators, the resistance was quite strong. Advocacy for people to understand that it's to their own benefit.
We'll take a break at this point. We'll come back and we'll wrap up this conversation. Please stay with us. Well, Professor Sidney Ibeanusi, Country Director and Focal Person of the UN Decade of Action on Road Safety and Injury Prevention in Nigeria, and also a Professor of Ortho Trauma and Acute Care Surgery, is still with us in the studio. We're talking about road crashes in Nigeria and how to bring them down. I'm wondering, in your profession, I'm sure you must see a lot of accident victims.
Yes.
I mean, on a daily basis, how does this, I don't know if you're still actively practicing, but how does this affect you?
Oh, it does, certainly. As a trauma surgeon, over 70% of the burden of trauma in this country are from road crashes. When people moved on with the use of commercial motorcycles as a means of livelihood, and then most of these people are not trained, and so they just buy the motorcycle and their commercial drivers and all that. So they cause a lot of problem in terms of rushing, and then even the vehicle, the four-wheel drives and the bigger vehicles. Once a crash happens, maybe they're carrying one passenger and then four passengers, one driver, four passengers, or even the buses. So you have more persons in these vehicles, and one crash will take 18 persons for mini buses. For other vehicles, maybe 4 or 5 persons and all that. So when you're in an emergency room and these persons come and you just realize that this is a preventable disease and all that, and you see the number of persons that are being killed or the persons that are losing their source of livelihood. Some of them end up surviving, but they become amputees. Some of them end up surviving and they become paraplegic, okay, and they can't walk again. They're wheelchair bound and all that, and so it's quite traumatic in terms of emotional trauma, and then the social consequences are really huge.
I'm wondering though, does it give you any comfort that a lot of state governments are banning motorcycles for transport, especially for commercial transport, even though in many instances it's been fueled more by security than safety? That's
correct. That's correct. You see, aside the safety aspect of it, the safety is a major concern. In fact, initial ban was more of a safety issue, but later, of course, people try to use that to break the law and all, and of course, they now have the security aspect of it. But be that as it may, do we have to completely ban them? I think what we need to do is to regulate their activity, have them registered. Now we're beginning to do digital registration and all that. Have them registered, know who is what, and they provide a huge chunk of employment to a lot of persons. We are talking of a lot of youth are not employed and all that. So a lot of persons who probably will not work in offices, who will not. That's some form of livelihood for them, and for persons who cannot afford, so they can use those means of transportation and all that. But as long as they're regulated and they are running by the rules of the law. You must use the crash helmet, okay? And of course, your vehicle or whatever, it must be in good condition. And of course, the tires and all that, and the traffic lights, and they all are working and all that. So, and then of course, remain within the speed limit. Okay? Yeah, and do not carry more passengers than they should.
That is very important.
So that way, they may have, they're quite a large pool. From the incidentally, there are stakeholders. We have all sorts of
motorcycle riders.
Interesting. Yes, the Association of Motorcycle Riders, Tricycle Riders. They have their issues here and there, but they are members of. So we thought we should bring them on board. There are over 15 million members, and all that. That's a huge population. Are
you optimistic that this time around, this second decade of action, we'll be able to meet the targets that we have set for ourselves? Do you see the drive there?
I think having realized that what needs to be done needs to be done. I think the UN has even made it easier. that whereas they may not be able to reduce road crashes by 50%, reduce the number of persons dying or maimed by 50%. I think that is an achievable target, particularly if we adopt this fail-safe system approach, reducing speed, which we have contributed to a lot of the crashes, over 50% of the crashes to most extent. The human behavior, again, take about 40%. And then, of course, post-crash response, I will talk. The accident had happened, respond to it, get the victims early, treat them, stabilize them, and take them to the hospitals for appropriate treatment. And you know what the federal government is doing through the Federal Ministry of Health is to ensure that persons who get in to be treated during the emergency for the 8 hours are treated without recourse to payment at the time of care. Okay, payment can come later, but at the time, a point of care, nobody's asking you for treatment, nobody asks for police report. So those are things we've been able to achieve by engaging even the police as part of our stakeholders and all that. So we're putting these whole processes in place, and then, of course, channeling this whole drive through the sub-national governments, like I did say, the state governments and the local governments. Then, of course, we should be able to. One thing I want to mention, the pedestrian, the cyclists, the tricyclists constitute, and these people are actually seen around the city centers and the rural communities. They constitute almost 60 or 70% of the road users. So if you protect them by adopting the Street for Life approach, then that's a huge chunk that you've protected. Of course, the ones that travel on the highway and all that, of course, is another group. And those ones, also, there are also processes to ensure that they also remain safe. But this targeted is a focused and targeted approach to addressing the issues. So I think we might be able to hit the target.
Well, Prof, we have to thank you so much for sharing your thoughts this morning and throwing more light on the new targets that we have for the second decade of action. Professor Sidney Ibianus is the country director and focal person, UN Decade of Action on Road Safety and Injury Prevention, Nigeria. He's also a professor of ortho trauma and acute care surgery.